with the Pearl of Africa Hotel behind me. This is Josh Friedman wrapping up my stay in Uganda, which has been an interesting week plus. I've spent most of the time in Kampala, and I also ventured out and stayed in a small village by the town Mpigi. I was actually staying at this place called the Social Innovation Academy. I might speak briefly about that, but what I'd like to discuss is Uganda as a refugee host country and Uganda with respect to its neighborhood, which is a pretty tough neighborhood, I would say. So last time I was showing you some of the surroundings here in the center of Kampala, and now I think I'll talk, granted I've still got the same backdrop, but I think I'll talk about the surroundings of, or some surrounding countries and surrounding issues in the region that have to do with Uganda. Now first, with regard to this being a refugee host country, from the latest figures I've seen, Uganda is actually number 3 worldwide in terms of the number of refugees that it's hosting. According to the latest UNHCR figures I have seen, Uganda is hosting more than 1.2 million refugees, and I believe Uganda's trailing only Turkey and Pakistan in terms of the top refugee host countries in the world. That's probably something that a lot of people would not expect, but it is the case, and it's been the case for a long time. Not necessarily those figures, but Uganda's been hosting refugees for a long time, and I've discussed that a bit with regard to some of the history relating to Rwanda, how there have been many Rwandese refugees and just Rwandese living here over the years, largely due with the clashes that took place in the last century there in Rwanda. And I've also discussed how before he was president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame was indeed living here in Uganda. So that's a little perspective. Now, where are these refugees coming from? The majority of the refugees nowadays in Uganda come from South Sudan. I think there are about 800,000 or more South Sudanese who are living here as refugees in Uganda, and that's followed by refugees coming from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think there are more than 300,000 refugees from the DRC here in Uganda, according to the figures that I've seen. And I've actually met a couple refugees from the DRC during my stay here in Uganda, one of whom, maybe two, I'm forgetting, I met at the Social Innovation Academy, which I'll just mention very briefly. It's this social entrepreneurship program that's meant to empower women and young people coming from troubled backgrounds, and it's on some hill outside of the town in Mpigi. Interesting place. Anyway, so Uganda actually gets a lot of praise from the international community, particularly from the main refugee organizations like the UNHCR, and I think they get praise from Amnesty International as well. These organizations say Uganda's doing so much to help refugees, and other countries need to take in a fair share and relieve some of the burden on countries like Uganda. And I find this to be very interesting because on the one hand, Uganda's getting all this humanitarian cred with regard to its taking in of refugees, but at the same time, Uganda gets a lot of criticism for alleged human rights abuses and for the lack of, or perceived lack of, civil liberties and political liberties in this country. The president, Yoweri Museveni, as I've mentioned before, has been in power since 1986, and he is quite the strongman type, and as I've discussed, he's clashing with another strongman in the region who I've already discussed in this video, Paul Kagame. That dispute between Rwanda and Uganda that I was talking about a week ago is still ongoing. They're about 3 weeks deep in this border dispute and diplomatic clash between Rwanda and Uganda that has a lot of people in the region concerned, and part of that has to do with the allegations coming from the Rwandan side. As I've mentioned before, the Rwandan government alleges that Uganda and the authorities here in Uganda have arrested, detained, held captive, and even tortured a bunch of Rwandese in this country. Once again, I cannot verify these allegations, but having looked into it a little bit, it does seem like there's some truth to what's coming out of the government in Kigali, or Chigali, as locals tend to pronounce it. There have been numerous reports of Rwandese who have been detained or arrested and held and then eventually released here in Uganda. But I'm not going to get into this in depth, and I really don't know what the truth is with all these allegations, but it's one of many alleged abuses of civil liberties and human rights that people claim are happening here. It's kind of hard for me to judge, just to what extent this is an authoritarian country, but I do get somewhat of an impression it is. As I've mentioned before, just walking around the streets here, people flipped out on me for merely filming myself, not even filming them. I've also come across, interestingly, there's an internet tax in Uganda, which I did pay when I was purchasing some data in a SIM card. It was very small for me, but I've heard, or at least it's been reported in Western press, I don't know to what extent it's true, but that the tax, which went in, I believe, last year, has dramatically impacted in a negative way use of internet, social media, and messaging systems, and possibly even mobile payment systems, which are surprisingly popular in this region. I haven't discussed that. Anyway, so it's very interesting how, on the one hand, this seems to be a fairly authoritarian country. The president's been in power for more than 30 years. There are alleged human rights abuses. There's a diplomatic spat with a neighboring country, part of which has to do with alleged abuses, like I've said. And at the same time, Uganda gets a whole lot of praise for being this global leader, or one of the global leaders, in coming to the aid of refugees. Now, I would wonder to what extent Uganda comes to the aid of refugees out of mere necessity. The region is quite troubled. We're not going to delve into all the conflicts, some of which Uganda and Museveni have been involved in, some of which seem to be coming back to life right now with the clash between Uganda and Rwanda. I've talked about how that relates to the Congo. But anyway, so it's a very troubled region. All right, let's talk about the Congo, for instance. So there's been war and violence neighboring DRC for a long time, but over the past couple decades, going back a couple of decades, there were the terrible Congo Wars, which some people refer to the second as the Great War of Africa, and there have been problems that have remained there since, and even now, not just are there problems in terms of violence and political issues, but now they're even almost right by the Ugandan border. There's been an Ebola outbreak. Ebola's been an issue plaguing the Congo or DRC in recent years, and one outbreak has been very close to the Ugandan border, and then there's problems obviously in South Sudan if there are 800,000 refugees from South Sudan here, and historically Uganda has clashed with Tanzania. There's the war there's the Rwandan genocide and the history of Rwandese here, so you wonder to what extent Uganda is this big refugee host country out of necessity. It's a very problem-plagued region, although it seems like the region is starting to come out of its more troubled years. If you go back a couple decades, there's genocide and war, and that it's not really the case now. And now there's this East African community, although there's a lot of concern, as I've discussed, about the fate of the East African community, particularly as this diplomatic spat between Rwanda and Uganda play out. So anyway, I've shared with you some of the issues that plague the region. It's a troubled community that Uganda is right in the middle of, but Uganda, regardless of intent, seems to be doing quite a lot to help out with humanitarian crises around here, at least in the form of hosting refugees. So the sun's setting on this evening, this day, the sun's setting on my time in Uganda. Hopefully I'll be back here sometime. There are definitely some things I like about the country, and I'd like to see a little more of the nature and the wildlife, because after all, that's what prompted Winston Churchill to deem this place the Pearl of Africa. So from the Pearl of Africa, with the Pearl of Africa Hotel off in the distance behind me, thank you very much for joining me on my trip in Uganda, and I will be coming to you from Kenya. Stay tuned. So long for now, and Webali, as they say here in Uganda.